The blistering sun beat down on Thornton Valley, Nevada, as Tabitha Zane clutched her small bundle of possessions to her chest, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face. 6 months pregnant and now homeless, she watched as the last of the townspeople who had escorted her to the edge of their community turned their backs and walked away, leaving her alone on the dusty trail that led into the vast emptiness of the Nevada wilderness. It was 1876, and being an unwed mother was more than just scandalous, it was grounds for complete social exile. "God help me," Tabitha whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. The child inside her kicked in response, as if to remind her that she was not entirely alone in this world. But as she gazed at the endless landscape of sagebrush and rocky terrain stretching before her, the crushing weight of her situation nearly brought her to her knees. Tabitha had been working as a schoolteacher in Thornton Valley for just over a year when Thomas Bradley, a traveling businessman, swept into town with promises of love and a future together. By the time she discovered she was carrying his child, Thomas had already moved on to the next town, the next woman, leaving nothing behind but empty promises and a growing life inside her. When the town council discovered her condition, the verdict was swift and merciless. The women of the town, led by the mayor's wife, declared her unfit to teach their children. The men of the town, unwilling to have such a fallen woman among them, voted unanimously for her removal. Even Pastor Williams, who preached forgiveness every Sunday, had stood silent as they stripped her of her position, her home, and her dignity. "You'll corrupt our children with your loose ways," Mrs. Holloway, the mayor's wife, had spat. "Thornton Valley has standards to maintain." Now, as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains, Tabitha forced herself to put one foot in front of the other. She had enough food for perhaps 2 days, a canteen half full of water, and the clothes on her back. Her future, like the barren landscape around her, seemed empty and unforgiving. After walking for what felt like hours, her feet blistered and her back aching from the weight of her unborn child, Tabitha spotted a small creek cutting through the valley floor. With relief flooding through her exhausted body, she made her way to the water's edge and collapsed onto a flat rock. She dipped her handkerchief into the cool water and pressed it against her flushed face, allowing herself a moment of respite from the relentless heat. "Madam, are you all right?" The deep voice startled her, and Tabitha nearly toppled into the creek as she whirled around to face its source. Standing a few yards away was a tall man with a weathered face partially hidden beneath the brim of a dusty brown hat. His clothes were those of a working man, worn but clean, and his stance was cautious, as if approaching a wounded animal. I'm fine," Tabitha said automatically, though nothing could have been further from the truth. The man's eyes, a startling shade of blue against his sun-bronzed skin, flickered briefly to her pregnant belly before returning to her face. Unlike the judgment and disgust she'd grown accustomed to seeing in the eyes of the townspeople, his gaze held only concern. "You don't look fine if you don't mind my saying so," he replied, taking a tentative step closer. "I'm Angus Keller. I have a ranch about a mile east of here." He gestured vaguely behind him. "Tabitha Zane," she responded, her voice barely above a whisper, "former schoolteacher of Thornton Valley." "Former?" Angus questioned, his brow furrowing. Tabitha's chin lifted slightly, a small act of defiance born from months of enduring whispers and stares. "They don't take kindly to unwed mothers teaching their children." "I was informed this morning that my services would no longer be required, and that my presence in town was unwelcome." Angus's expression darkened. "They put you out, in your condition." His gaze swept over her again, taking in her travel-worn appearance and the small bundle of possessions at her feet. "They just left you out here with nowhere to go. They were kind enough to let me keep my books," Tabitha replied, attempting a bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. Angus removed his hat and ran a hand through his sandy-colored hair, clearly struggling with what to say next. "Miss Zane, I don't mean to be forward, but night's coming, and these parts aren't safe for anyone to be wandering alone, especially not." He trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward her. I'm aware of my predicament, Mr. Keller, Tabitha said, a flash of her former strength returning. But I don't see many options before me. Angus replaced his hat and cleared his throat. I have a small cabin on my property. It's not much was going to be for a ranch hand I was planning to hire come spring, but it's got a roof and a bed. You'd be welcome to stay there tonight, or longer if need be, until you sort things out. Tabitha studied the man before her. In Thornton Valley, she'd learned to be wary of the kindness of men, especially those offering shelter to women in desperate situations. But there was something in Angus Keller's eyes, a steadiness, a decency that made her want to trust him. "Why would you help me?" she asked bluntly. "You don't know me. My ma raised me to believe that how we treat folks in need says more about us than anything else," Angus replied simply. "And I know enough about Thornton Valley to know they're quick to judge and slow to forgive. It ain't right what they did to you." Tabitha weighed her options. She could continue walking into the unknown with night approaching and her supplies dwindling, or she could accept the help of this stranger who, despite his rough exterior, seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare. "I have no money to pay for lodging," she admitted. "I'm not asking for payment," Angus said firmly, "just offering a safe place to rest." After a moment's hesitation, Tabitha nodded. "Then I accept your kind offer, Mr. Keller, for tonight at least." Angus's face relaxed into a slight smile. "My horse is tied up just over that rise." "Can you walk a bit further, or shall I bring him here?" "I can walk," Tabitha assured him, gathering her bundle and rising to her feet with as much dignity as her swollen body would allow. Angus led her to where a sturdy chestnut gelding was tethered to a scrubby tree. He helped Tabitha mount, handling her with a gentleness that surprised her, then swung up behind her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Hold tight to the saddle horn," he instructed, and then they were moving, the horse picking its way carefully across the uneven terrain. As they rode, Tabitha found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. What had seemed barren and hostile before now revealed subtle beauties. The way the late afternoon sun painted the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold, the unexpected patches of wildflowers clinging to life among the rocks, the graceful flight of a hawk circling overhead. "It's beautiful out here," she murmured, almost to herself. "Takes some getting used to," Angus replied. "But yes, it has its own kind of beauty, different from back east but no less real. You're not from here originally, Pennsylvania, came west after the war needed." "Space, I guess you could say." Tabitha nodded, understanding more than he probably realized. She too had come west seeking space to breathe, to build a life away from the suffocating expectations of her family in Boston, who had mapped out her future as the wife of a man 3 times her age, but with connections that would benefit her father's business. "There it is," Angus said, interrupting her thoughts. Keller Ranch. Ahead of them, nestled in a natural depression in the land that offered some protection from the wind, stood a modest but well-maintained ranch house. Nearby were a barn, a corral with several horses, and what appeared to be a chicken coop. And set slightly apart, perhaps 100 yards from the main house, was a small cabin, its chimney dark against the darkening sky. "It's not much," Angus said, misinterpreting her silence for disappointment. "But it's home. It's wonderful," Tabitha said honestly. After the uncertainty of the past few hours, the sight of this little haven in the wilderness felt like a miracle. Angus guided the horse toward the cabin and dismounted first, then helped Tabitha down with steady hands. Up close, she could see that the cabin, though small, had been built with care. The logs were well fitted, the single window was intact and clean, and the door hung straight on its hinges. "I finished it last fall," Angus explained as he pushed open the door. "Haven't had much cause to use it yet, though." Inside was a simple room with a bed against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a few shelves holding basic supplies. It was clean and smelled of fresh wood and the sage that grew abundantly in the surrounding area. "The outhouse is just around back," Angus said, gesturing vaguely. "And there's a pump for water by the main house, though you're welcome to use the kitchen pump inside when it gets colder." "This is more than generous," Tabitha said, setting her bundle on the table. "I don't know how to thank you." Angus shuffled his feet, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. No need for thanks. Let me get a fire going for you and then I'll bring over some supper, unless you'd prefer to eat at the main house. The thought of walking even the short distance to the main house made Tabitha's aching feet throb in protest. Here would be fine if it's not too much trouble. No trouble at all, Angus assured her. He busied himself with lighting the stove, his movements efficient and practiced. Once the fire was catching, he straightened up and headed for the door. I'll be back shortly with some food. Left alone, Tabitha sank onto the edge of the bed, allowing herself to really feel the exhaustion that had been building throughout the day. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the reassuring movement of her child. We're safe for tonight, little one, she whispered. And tomorrow, well, tomorrow we'll figure something out. But as she looked around the snug cabin, with its solid walls and promise of warmth, she couldn't help but wonder if perhaps she had already found more than just a temporary shelter. Perhaps, against all odds, she had found a place where she and her child might begin to build a new life, a life beyond the judgment of Thornton Valley and its unforgiving residents. True to his word, Angus returned within the hour, carrying a tray laden with a steaming bowl of stew, fresh bread, and a small pitcher of milk. The simple meal was the most welcome sight Tabitha had seen all day. It's not fancy, Angus said, setting the tray on the table, but it's filling. It looks wonderful, Tabitha assured him, already moving to the table, drawn by the savory aroma of the stew. Do you cook often? Every day, Angus replied with a small shrug. Been on my own for a while now. No wife, family? Tabitha asked, then immediately regretted her forwardness. Forgive me, that's none of my business. No need to apologize, Angus said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door, a surprisingly domestic gesture that suggested he was comfortable in the small space. No wife. My parents passed before I came west. Had a brother, but he didn't make it back from Gettysburg. I'm sorry, Tabitha said softly, understanding the weight of loss behind his simple statement. Angus nodded in acknowledgement. What about you? Besides Thornton Valley, I mean, any family that might help with your situation? Tabitha took a spoonful of stew to give herself a moment before answering. My father made it clear that if I left Boston against his wishes, I was no longer welcome in his home. My mother, she might have been more understanding, but she's never stood against my father in anything. And the father of your child? Angus asked, his tone careful, not accusatory. A traveling salesman with pretty words and empty promises, Tabitha replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Long gone by the time I realized I was carrying his child. Angus's expression hardened momentarily, but he said nothing, allowing Tabitha to eat in silence for a few minutes. The stew is delicious, she said eventually, genuinely impressed. You're quite the cook, Mr. Keller. Angus, please, he insisted, and thank you. It's just a simple recipe my mother taught me years ago. Well, she taught you well. Angus, Tabitha said, testing the familiarity of his given name. A comfortable silence fell between them as Tabitha continued her meal. Outside, the last light of day was fading, giving way to a star-filled sky that seemed to stretch endlessly above the isolated ranch. What will you do now? Angus asked finally, his deep voice gentle in the quiet room. Tabitha set down her spoon and met his gaze squarely. Honestly, I don't know. I had planned to have the baby in Thornton Valley to keep teaching. I had saved almost enough to rent a small place of my own. She sighed, running a hand absently over her belly. Now, I suppose I'll need to find another town, another position, though I imagine my condition will make that difficult. You could stay here, Angus said, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did her. I mean, until after the baby comes, at least. This cabin isn't being used, and it's not good for you to be traveling in your condition. Tabitha stared at him, searching his face for any sign of ulterior motive, any hint of the judgment she'd grown accustomed to seeing in the eyes of others. She found only sincerity and what appeared to be genuine concern. Why would you do that for a stranger? She asked, not for the first time that day. Angus seemed to consider his answer carefully. I know what it's like to be alone in the world, he said finally. After the war, when I first came out here, I was Lost, I guess you could say. A neighbor, old man Jenkins, took me in, taught me ranching, gave me purpose again. I wouldn't have made it without his help." He paused, his gaze steady on hers. "Sometimes folks just need a hand up when life's knocked them down. Nothing more complicated than that." Tabitha felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, tears she'd been fighting back all day. And what would people say? A single woman living on the property of a bachelor. "Your reputation," Angus waved a dismissive hand. "I don't much care what people say. Besides, out here, neighbors are few and far between. The closest ranch is 5 miles east, and they mind their own business." "I wouldn't want to be a burden," Tabitha insisted, though the thought of having a safe place to bring her child into the world was almost too tempting to resist. "You wouldn't be," Angus assured her. "In fact, I could use the help. I've got accounts that need keeping, correspondence that's been piling up. I heard you were a school teacher. I figure that means you're good with numbers and writing." Tabitha couldn't help but smile at his transparent attempt to make her feel useful rather than charitable. "I am indeed good with numbers and writing, very good in fact." "Then it's settled," Angus said, standing up and retrieving his hat. "You stay here, help with the books, and in return you have a safe place until after the baby comes. After that, well, we can figure things out then." Tabitha wanted to argue further, to insist that it couldn't possibly be so simple, but exhaustion was overtaking her, and the thought of having even a temporary solution to her most immediate problems was overwhelming. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know how I'll ever repay such kindness." Angus shook his head. "No repayment necessary, just get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning." With that, he bid her good night and left, closing the door softly behind him. Tabitha sat for a long moment, staring at the space where he had been, trying to make sense of the day's dramatic turn of events. This morning she had been a respected teacher, by noon an outcast, and now, as night fell, she found herself the unexpected recipient of a stranger's compassion. As she prepared for bed, using the basin of water Angus had left for her to wash away the dust of her journey, Tabitha reflected on the man who had so unexpectedly entered her life. There was a solidity to Angus Keller, a quiet strength that reminded her of the mountains visible on the horizon, weathered by time and elements, but standing firm nonetheless. She climbed into the bed, which was surprisingly comfortable, with fresh-smelling sheets that suggested Angus had prepared the cabin with care. As she drifted toward sleep, her hand resting protectively on her belly, Tabitha allowed herself to hope just a little that perhaps the worst was behind her. Morning came with the gentle cacophony of ranch life, roosters crowing, horses nickering, and the distant lowing of cattle. Tabitha woke feeling more rested than she had in weeks. The weight of secrecy and impending judgment lifted from her shoulders, at least temporarily. She dressed quickly, eager to prove herself useful to the man who had offered her shelter when she needed it most. Outside, the day was clear and bright, the vast Nevada sky a brilliant blue above the rugged landscape. Tabitha took a moment to simply breathe in the clean, sage-scented air before making her way toward the main house. She found Angus in the barn, mucking out stalls with the same quiet efficiency she had noticed in everything he did. "Good morning," she called, pausing at the entrance. Angus looked up, surprise briefly crossing his features before he smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "Morning, sleep well, better than I expected to," Tabitha admitted. "I wanted to thank you again for your kindness and to see how I might make myself useful today." Angus leaned his pitchfork against a stall and wiped his hands on a rag. "Had breakfast yet? I usually eat after the first chores are done." "I haven't," Tabitha confessed, realizing she was indeed quite hungry. "Then that's our first order of business," Angus declared, gesturing for her to follow him to the main house. The interior of Angus's home was much like the man himself, unpretentious but solid, with a kind of rough-hewn charm. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large fireplace on one wall, a wooden table with 4 chairs, and a couple of comfortable-looking armchairs. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled not only with books but also with small carved wooden figures, horses mainly, but also other animals and even a few human forms. Did you make these? Tabitha asked, drawn to the intricate carvings. Angus nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. Keeps my hands busy in the evenings. They're beautiful, Tabitha said honestly, admiring the detail in a carving of a mare and foal. Thank you, Angus mumbled, turning his attention to the stove. Hope you like eggs and bacon. It's about all I know how to cook for breakfast. Eggs and bacon sound perfect, Tabitha assured him, moving to help. May I set the table? Angus directed her to the cupboard where plates and utensils were kept, and they worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, moving around each other in the kitchen with surprising ease, as if they'd been sharing the space for years rather than hours. As they ate, Angus outlined the daily rhythm of the ranch, feeding and caring for the animals, checking fence lines, tending the small vegetable garden, and the endless maintenance that a working ranch required. It's not much as ranches go, he admitted. Just enough cattle to make a decent living, a few horses I breed and train on the side, but it's mine, free and clear. It's impressive, Tabitha countered. Especially for someone who didn't grow up ranching, Angus shrugged off the compliment. After breakfast, I'll show you where I keep the account books. They're in a sorry state, I'm afraid. Never was much good with numbers. After they'd cleared away the breakfast dishes, Tabitha insisting on washing them despite Angus's protests, he led her to a small room off the main living area that served as a study of sorts. A desk stood against one wall, piled high with papers, ledgers, and correspondence. Like I said, it's a mess, Angus said, looking somewhat sheepish. Been meaning to sort it out, but there always seems to be something more pressing to attend to. Tabitha surveyed the chaos with the practiced eye of someone who had managed a classroom of 20 children of varying ages and abilities. It's nothing that can't be organized with a bit of time and effort, she assured him. May I? At his nod, she began sorting through the papers, creating piles based on content bills, receipts, personal correspondence, and business matters. As she worked, Angus hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable with being idle while she worked. You don't need to stay, Tabitha told him gently. I'm sure you have other tasks that require your attention. You're right, Angus admitted. Need to check the north pasture fence. One of the hands from the Tucker place said he saw some of my cattle straying that way yesterday. Then go, Tabitha said firmly. I'll be fine here. This is the kind of work I enjoy, actually. Angus hesitated a moment longer, then nodded. I'll be back by midday. There's food in the kitchen if you get hungry before then. After he'd gone, Tabitha settled more comfortably at the desk and continued her work. The task of bringing order to the chaotic mass of papers was oddly satisfying, and as the morning wore on, she found herself becoming increasingly engrossed in learning about the financial workings of the ranch. From what she could piece together from the scattered records, Angus was doing reasonably well. The ranch wasn't large, but it was productive, and he seemed to have a good head for business despite his self-professed difficulties with bookkeeping. His records showed fair dealings with his neighbors and the merchants in the nearest town, which appeared to be a place called Red Rock, about 15 miles to the west farther than Thornton Valley, which lay to the south. By midday, Tabitha had made significant progress. She had organized all of the papers into logical categories, updated the account ledger with several months' worth of transactions, and even drafted responses to a few business inquiries that had gone unanswered. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear Angus return until he cleared his throat from the doorway. You've been busy, he observed, looking at the now orderly desk with evident approval. Time flies when the work is interesting, Tabitha replied, setting down her pen. Your ranch is doing quite well from what I can see. Is it? Angus asked, sounding genuinely surprised. That's good to know. Tabitha smiled at his response, which confirmed her suspicion that he'd been running the business by instinct rather than careful accounting. Yes, it is. And it could do even better with some minor adjustments to how you're managing certain expenses. Angus raised an eyebrow. Is that so? For instance, Tabitha continued, warming to her subject, you're paying too much for feed from the mercantile in Red Rock when you could get it for less from the mill in Carson City. It's a bit further to travel, but the savings would more than make up for the extra time. Huh, Angus said, looking impressed. You figured all that out from these old papers? Numbers tell stories if you know how to read them, Tabitha said, then blushed at how pedantic she must sound. Sorry, that's the school teacher in me. No need to apologize, Angus assured her. It's impressive and helpful, he gestured toward the kitchen. I brought back some cold chicken for lunch if you're hungry. As they ate, Tabitha found herself relaxing in Angus's company. There was something soothing about his presence, a steadiness, a lack of pretense that made conversation easy despite their short acquaintance. May I ask you something? Tabitha said as they finished their meal. Of course. Yesterday, when you found me by the creek, why did you stop? Most men would have ridden on by, especially seeing. She gestured to her pregnant belly. Angus was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. I suppose because you looked like you needed help, he said finally, and because I know what Thornton Valley is like. They put on a good show of being decent, God-fearing folks, but there's not much Christian charity in how they treat people who don't fit their narrow view of what's proper. You've had dealings with them? Tabitha asked, curious about his evident distaste for her former home. Some, Angus admitted. When I first came to these parts, I tried to establish trade with them, but they made it clear that a former Union soldier wasn't welcome in their businesses. The war has been over for more than a decade, Tabitha said, surprised. Some wounds heal slower than others, Angus replied with a shrug, especially when people aren't inclined to let them heal in the first place. Tabitha nodded, understanding all too well how some communities clung to old grievances, old judgments. Well, their loss is my gain, it seems. If they had welcomed you, you might not have established your ranch here, and I might still be sitting by that creek wondering where to go. Angus's mouth quirked in a half-smile. I suppose that's one way of looking at it. The days that followed settled into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Each morning, Tabitha would wake, dress, and join Angus for breakfast in the main house. After the meal, she would spend the morning working in the study, continuing to organize the ranch's finances and correspondence while Angus attended to the physical labor of running the property. They would reunite for the midday meal, during which they would discuss the morning's progress, Tabitha sharing insights about the business side of the ranch, Angus updating her on the condition of the cattle, the repairs needed on outbuildings, or the progress of the vegetable garden. In the afternoons, when the summer heat made indoor work preferable, Tabitha would often read from Angus's modest but eclectic library, or work on mending clothing, a skill she'd learned from necessity during her years of independent living. As her pregnancy advanced, she found herself also preparing for the baby's arrival, fashioning simple garments from fabric Angus had purchased during a supply run to Red Rock. Evenings were perhaps Tabitha's favorite time. After supper, which they took together in the main house, they would often sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the landscape in brilliant hues of orange and purple. Sometimes they talked about books they had read, about Angus's experiences during the war, though he spoke of these sparingly and with evident reluctance, about Tabitha's childhood in Boston and her journey west in search of independence. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts while the vast Nevada sky darkened above them and the first stars appeared. It was during one such evening, about 3 weeks after Tabitha's arrival at the ranch, that she found the courage to broach a subject that had been weighing on her mind. Angus, she began, her voice barely audible above the gentle evening breeze, I've been thinking about what happens after the baby comes. Angus turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. What are your thoughts? Tabitha chose her words carefully. You've been more than generous, offering me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. But I can't impose on you indefinitely. Once the baby is born and I've recovered enough to travel, I should move on, find a place where we can build a proper life. Is that what you want? Angus asked, his tone neutral. What I want, Tabitha repeated, surprised by the question. Few people in her life had ever asked what she wanted, most simply told her what she should do, what was proper, what was expected. I'm not sure, Angus was silent for a long moment. The offer I made when you first arrived stands. You're welcome to stay as long as you need to or want to. The cabin is yours for as long as you choose to use it. But why? Tabitha pressed, needing to understand his continued generosity. You've known me less than a month. I'm carrying another man's child. Surely you must see how people would talk if I stayed. Let them talk, Angus said, an edge of steel entering his voice. I told you before I don't much care what others think, and as for why, he paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. You bring life to this place, Tabitha. Before you came, it was just a ranch. Now it feels more like a home. The simple honesty of his words caught Tabitha off guard, and she felt tears spring to her eyes, a frequent occurrence these days, which she blamed on her condition rather than the unexpected tenderness of the man beside her. I feel at home here too, she admitted softly. More than I have anywhere since leaving Boston, but I can't help feeling that I'm taking advantage of your kindness. You're not, Angus assured her. The work you've done with the accounts alone has more than earned your keep, and… He hesitated, then continued with careful deliberation. I've grown accustomed to your company. I'd miss it if you left. The admission hung in the air between them, neither a declaration nor a request, but something more tentative, a door left slightly ajar, inviting Tabitha to decide whether to walk through it or not. I'd miss your company too, she said finally, deciding on honesty. More than I expected to. Angus nodded, accepting her words without pushing for more. Then stay, at least until you know where you want to go next. There's no rush to decide anything. As August gave way to September and Tabitha's pregnancy entered its final weeks, the changing season brought new tasks to the ranch. Angus spent long days preparing for winter, repairing the barn roof, chopping and stacking firewood, smoking meat, and putting up preserves from the garden. Tabitha helped where she could, though her advanced condition limited her physical activities. Instead, she focused on making the cabin more comfortable for the baby's arrival. Arranging a corner as a nursery with a cradle that Angus had purchased on his latest trip to Red Rock, a gesture that had moved Tabitha to tears when he presented it to her. It's not fancy, he'd said, running a hand along the simple but well-crafted wooden edge, but it's sturdy. Like everything about Angus Keller, Tabitha had thought but not said aloud. One crisp morning in late September, as the leaves of the few deciduous trees on the property were beginning to turn golden, Tabitha was sitting at the table in the cabin, mending one of Angus's shirts, when a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen. She gasped, dropping the needle and thread as her hands flew to her belly. Not yet, she whispered, even as another pain gripped her. It's too soon. But the baby, it seemed, had other ideas. As the contractions continued, growing more intense with each passing hour, Tabitha realized that, ready or not, her child was determined to enter the world that day. Angus had ridden out at dawn to check on cattle in the far pasture and wasn't expected back until late afternoon. Tabitha considered her options as she paced the small confines of the cabin, pausing to breathe through each contraction. She had helped at births before, one of the many duties that had fallen to her as the teacher in a small town, but experiencing labor firsthand was altogether different. By midday, the contractions were coming regularly, about 10 minutes apart. Tabitha had prepared as best she could, boiling water, laying out clean linens, and positioning herself on the bed between pains. She was grateful now for the books on midwifery she had studied in preparation, though the academic knowledge seemed woefully inadequate in the face of the reality she now faced. When she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin in the early afternoon, hours before Angus was due to return, Tabitha felt a surge of relief so intense it brought fresh tears to her eyes. Somehow he knew. Somehow he had sensed she needed him and returned early. The door burst open and Angus stood there, his face etched with concern. Mrs. Tucker from the neighboring ranch rode out to find me, he explained breathlessly. Said she had a feeling you might need help today. Tabitha would later marvel at the intuition of the woman she had never met, but at that moment she could only nod, another contraction stealing her ability to speak. I'll fetch Mrs. Tucker, Angus said, already turning to leave. She's a midwife of sorts, delivered most of the babies in these parts. Hurry, Tabitha managed to gasp as the contraction eased. The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. Mrs. Tucker, a no-nonsense woman with capable hands and a calm demeanor, arrived within the hour and took charge of the situation with quiet efficiency. Angus was banished to the porch, where he paced restlessly, the sound of his boots on the wooden boards a strange comfort to Tabitha as she labored. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when, with a final, tremendous effort, Tabitha brought her child into the world. The lusty cry that filled the cabin was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "A boy, Mrs. Tucker announced, cleaning and wrapping the infant before placing him in Tabitha's trembling arms. "A fine, strong boy." Tabitha looked down at her son's face, taking in the shock of dark hair, the perfectly formed features, the tiny hands already curled into determined fists. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm your mother." After ensuring that both mother and child were stable, Mrs. Tucker invited Angus back into the cabin. He entered hesitantly, his eyes immediately finding Tabitha and the bundle in her arms. "Come meet him," Tabitha invited, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the joy of the moment. Angus approached the bed with reverence, his weathered face softening as he gazed down at the newborn. "He's perfect," he said simply. "Would you like to hold him?" Tabitha asked. Angus looked startled by the offer. I've never held a baby before." "There's nothing to it," Mrs. Tucker assured him, taking the infant from Tabitha and demonstrating how to support the head before transferring the baby to Angus's arms. The sight of the strong, capable rancher cradling her son with such gentle care brought fresh tears to Tabitha's eyes. There was something right about the image, something that felt like home in a way she hadn't experienced since childhood. "What will you name him?" Angus asked, his gaze still fixed on the baby's face. Tabitha had been considering names for months but had never settled on one. Now, looking at her son in Angus's arms, she knew. "Samuel," she said, "after my grandfather, Samuel Zane." "Samuel," Angus repeated, testing the name. "It suits him." Mrs. Tucker stayed for another hour, giving Tabitha instructions for the days ahead and promising to return the following day to check on mother and baby. After she left, Angus insisted on staying in the cabin, sleeping in the chair by the stove to be available if Tabitha or Samuel needed anything during the night. The first week of Samuel's life passed in a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and brief periods of sleep whenever the baby allowed. Angus divided his time between ranch work and helping Tabitha, proving surprisingly adept at soothing the fussy infant when Tabitha's own efforts failed. "You're a natural," Tabitha observed one evening as Angus walked the floor with Samuel, the baby's cries having subsided into contented gurgles. "He's easy to please," Angus replied, though the pride in his voice belied his modest words. "Just wants to be moving, I think. Got a restless spirit like his mother." Tabitha smiled at the comparison. "Perhaps, though lately I've been feeling less restless than I ever have before." Angus glanced at her, a question in his eyes, but didn't press for elaboration. Instead, he continued his slow circuit of the cabin, humming a tune that Tabitha didn't recognize, but that seemed to captivate Samuel's attention. As October progressed, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hint of frost to the mornings, Tabitha gradually resumed more of her regular activities. She began taking her meals at the main house again, carrying Samuel with her in a sling Angus had fashioned from a soft blanket. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Tabitha often reading aloud from one of Angus's books while he whittled a new project that he kept mysteriously covered when not working on it. It was during one such evening, with Samuel sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby, that Angus finally revealed what he had been creating. "I made something for Samuel," he said, somewhat self-consciously, as he handed Tabitha a small wooden figure. It was a horse, intricately carved with flowing mane and tail, each detail rendered with extraordinary care. But unlike the other carvings Tabitha had seen, this one had a rider, a small boy figure that seemed to radiate joy even in its wooden form. Angus, it's beautiful, Tabitha breathed, turning the carving in her hands to admire it from all angles. Thought he might like it when he gets older, Angus said, watching her reaction carefully. Every boy should have a toy horse. He'll treasure it, Tabitha assured him, deeply touched by the gesture. As do I, Angus cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. There's something else I've been meaning to talk to you about, he said, changing the subject. Winter's coming soon. The cabin gets mighty cold, even with the stove going. I've been thinking. It might be better if you and Samuel moved into the main house until spring. Tabitha looked up from the carving, surprised by the suggestion. Move into the main house, but where would we sleep? There's another bedroom, Angus explained, was going to be 4. Well, doesn't matter now. It's sitting empty, has been since I built the place, has a proper bed and everything. You'd be more comfortable there, both of you. Tabitha considered the offer. The practical advantages were undeniable. The main house was larger, better insulated, and would save her from having to trudge through snow with an infant when she wanted to visit Angus or help with the indoor ranch work. But there were other considerations, propriety chief among them. People would talk, she said, voicing her concern aloud, if they knew a single woman and her child were living under the same roof as a bachelor. Let them, Angus said, an edge of defiance in his tone. Anyone who'd think ill of a man offering shelter to a woman and her baby in winter isn't worth worrying about anyway. It's not just about what others would think, Tabitha pressed. It's about appearances, perceptions. Angus was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on hers across the warm glow of the fire. Tabitha, he said finally, in the months you've been here, I've come to care for you a great deal, and for Samuel too, though he's new to this world. I respect you too much to let anything improper happen under my roof, but I also care too much to let you and the boy suffer through winter in a drafty cabin when there's a perfectly good room going unused in my house. The simple honesty of his words touched something deep within Tabitha. In a world that had often treated her with judgment and cruelty, Angus Keller stood out as a beacon of decency and kindness. Thank you, she said softly. We'll accept your offer then, until spring. The first snow came earlier than expected, blanketing the ranch in white barely a week after Tabitha and Samuel had moved into the main house. The timing confirmed the wisdom of Angus's suggestion, as the temperature dropped sharply and remained bitter for days. Life in the main house quickly established a new rhythm. Tabitha took over much of the cooking, discovering that she enjoyed preparing meals for someone who appreciated her efforts so openly. Angus, in turn, spent his evenings entertaining Samuel, who at 6 weeks old had begun to focus his gaze and even offer the occasional smile in response to Angus's gentle teasing. The change in living arrangements also brought a new level of intimacy to their relationship, not physical intimacy. For Angus was scrupulously respectful of the boundaries Tabitha set, but an emotional closeness born of shared spaces and daily routines. They learned each other's habits, preferences, and moods in a way that would have taken much longer had they continued living separately. Tabitha discovered that Angus preferred coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, that he hummed unconsciously when lost in thought, and that he harbored a secret sweet tooth that made him almost boyishly delighted when she baked apple pie. Angus, in turn, learned that Tabitha was not a morning person despite her disciplined habits, that she had a dry wit that emerged when she was comfortable, and that she still sometimes woke in the night from dreams of being cast out by the town that had once been her home. On one such night in early December, Tabitha found herself unable to return to sleep after being awakened by Samuel's hungry cries. After feeding and settling the baby, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and padded quietly to the kitchen, intending to warm some milk to help her sleep. She was surprised to find Angus already there, seated at the table with a cup of something steaming before him, his expression distant as he stared into the dying embers of the fire. "Trouble sleeping?" she asked softly, not wanting to startle him. Angus looked up, his features relaxing into a small smile when he saw her. "Old habits," he said. "Always seem to wake around this time no matter how tired I am, From the war, Tabitha guessed, moving to the stove to prepare her milk. Angus nodded, watching as she worked. Midnight to 4 was my watch, more nights than I can count. Body still thinks it needs to be alert during those hours, even all these years later. Tabitha brought her warmed milk to the table and sat across from him. Do you ever wish you hadn't gone? To war, I mean. Angus considered the question seriously, as he did most things. No, he said finally. I lost a lot my brother friends, some of my hearing in my left ear from the cannon fire, but I believed in what we were fighting for, still do. Freedom, Tabitha said, understanding. Freedom, Angus agreed. For everyone, not just those who look like me or were born in the same place as me. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, each sipping their respective drinks. May I ask you something, Tabitha? Angus said eventually, his tone careful. Of course. The father of your child. Did you love him? The question caught Tabitha off guard, not because it was inappropriate. They had shared enough of their lives by now that such personal inquiries felt natural, but because she had never really examined her feelings for Thomas Bradley in those terms. I thought I did, she said honestly. Or perhaps I loved the idea of him, a handsome, educated man who seemed to value my mind as well as my company. But now, with the perspective of time, I think what I felt was closer to infatuation than love. He was exciting, different from the men I had known in Thornton Valley, and he said things I wanted to hear. He took advantage of you, Angus said, a hint of anger edging his voice. Perhaps, Tabitha acknowledged, but I was not entirely innocent in the matter. I chose to believe his promises, to ignore the signs that he might not be as steadfast as he claimed. Still doesn't excuse his behavior, Angus insisted. A man who fathers a child has a responsibility to that child and to the mother. And yet here we are, Tabitha said, gesturing to encompass the kitchen, the house, the life they had somehow built together over the past months. If Thomas had stayed, if he had married me as he promised, I would never have known this place, or you. The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate fully. I'm glad you're here, Angus said simply. Both of you? So am I, Tabitha replied, and was surprised to realize how completely she meant it. Christmas that year was a quiet affair, but more joyful than Tabitha had experienced in many years. Angus cut a small pine from his property and set it up in the corner of the main room, and Tabitha decorated it with strings of dried berries and paper ornaments she crafted during Samuel's nap times. On Christmas Eve, after Samuel had been fed and settled for what they hoped would be at least a few hours of sleep, Angus surprised Tabitha with a small gift, a silver locket on a delicate chain. It was my mother's, he explained as Tabitha opened the simple box he presented to her. One of the few things I brought with me when I came west. Thought you might like to put a lock of Samuel's hair in it when he's a bit older. Tabitha was speechless, both at the beauty of the gift and the sentiment behind it. Angus, I can't accept this, she protested weakly. It's a family heirloom. That's why I want you to have it, Angus said, his voice low and earnest. Because you and Samuel, you've become family to me, Tabitha, more than I ever expected to have again in this life. Tears welled in Tabitha's eyes at his words. We feel the same way about you, she whispered. You've given us so much more than shelter. You've given us a home. Angus reached across the space between them and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. There's something else I want to give you, he said, his voice slightly rough with emotion. If you'll accept it. What is it? Tabitha asked, her heart beating faster at the intensity of his gaze. A name, Angus said simply. Mine. I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, Tabitha. Not out of duty or obligation, but because these past months have shown me what it is to love someone completely, and I find that I love you with all that I am. Tabitha felt as though the world had momentarily stopped turning. Of all the gifts she might have expected, this declaration, this offer, was beyond her wildest hopes. Angus, she began, her voice trembling. Are you certain? Samuel isn't your child, and I, Samuel, may not have my blood, Angus interrupted gently, but he has my heart just as surely as you do. I want to be a father to him in every way that matters, and I want to be a husband to you if you'll have me. Tabitha looked into the eyes of this man who had taken her in when she had nothing, who had shown her kindness when the world had turned its back, who had loved her child as his own from the moment of his birth. "Yes," she said, the word catching on a sob of joy. "Yes, I will marry you, Angus Keller." Angus's face transformed with a smile more radiant than any Tabitha had yet seen from him. He leaned forward, and with a tenderness that made her heart ache, pressed his lips to hers in their first kiss, a promise of the life they would build together. They were married on New Year's Day, 1877, in a simple ceremony performed by a traveling minister who was passing through Red Rock on his circuit. Mrs. Tucker and her husband stood as witnesses, the only guests at the small wedding held in the main room of what was now truly their home. Samuel, now 3 months old and growing more alert by the day, was held by Mrs. Tucker during the brief exchange of vows. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Angus kissed Tabitha with a reverence that brought tears to Mrs. Tucker's eyes, and then turned to take Samuel in his arms, a symbolic embracing of both his new wife and the child he now legally claimed as his son. After the ceremony, as Mrs. and Mr. Tucker prepared to leave, Mrs. Tucker pulled Tabitha aside for a private word. "I knew from the first day I saw him holding that baby that this day would come," she said, her weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "Some things are just meant to be." "I never expected to find happiness again after Thornton Valley," Tabitha admitted, "especially not like this." "The good Lord works in mysterious ways," Mrs. Tucker said, patting Tabitha's hand. "Sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations." As winter gave way to spring and spring blossomed into summer, the Keller family settled into their life together with a contentment that neither Angus nor Tabitha had dared hope for before finding each other. Samuel grew from infant to toddler, taking his first steps across the wooden floor of the main room while Angus and Tabitha watched with pride and wonder. His first word was "Pa," uttered one evening as Angus carried him around the barn, showing him the horses and explaining ranch operations as if the child could understand every word. Tabitha continued to manage the ranch accounts, discovering a talent for business that complemented Angus's practical knowledge of ranching. Under their combined efforts, the ranch prospered, allowing them to hire 2 hands to help with the expanding herd and to make improvements to the main house, including the addition of a proper nursery for Samuel. In the fall of 1878, Tabitha discovered she was pregnant again. The news brought joy to both her and Angus, who had begun to hope for a larger family. Samuel, now a robust 2-year-old with his mother's dark hair and a smile that was all his own, seemed to sense the excitement in the household and took to patting Tabitha's still flat stomach and saying "baby" with solemn concentration. As Tabitha's pregnancy progressed, the family received unexpected news from Thornton Valley. The town's new schoolteacher had fallen ill and returned east, leaving the children without an instructor. The town council, desperate for a replacement, had swallowed their pride and sent a letter to Tabitha, offering her the position. "They must be truly desperate," Tabitha remarked as she showed the letter to Angus. "To offer employment to a woman they once cast out as morally unfit." Angus's expression darkened at the reminder of how Tabitha had been treated. "You're not considering it, are you?" "No," Tabitha assured him, placing the letter on the fire and watching as the flames consumed it. "My life is here now with you and Samuel. I have no desire to return to a place that showed me so little kindness." Angus wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands coming to rest on the gentle swell of her belly. "I'm glad," he murmured against her hair, "though I'd support you if it was something you wanted." Tabitha turned in his embrace to face him. "The only thing I want is right here," she said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "You gave me a home when I had none, Angus, not just a place to stay, but a true home. I could never leave that." In the spring of 1879, Tabitha gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Angus's mother. The birth was easier than Samuel's had been, with Mrs. Tucker once again serving as midwife and Angus pacing anxiously outside until the newborn's first cry signaled that all was well. Samuel, now an important 2.5-year-old, approached his baby sister with cautious curiosity, peering into the cradle with wide eyes. Gentle, Angus reminded him, showing his son how to touch the baby's tiny hand with the lightest of touches. "My sister," Samuel declared proudly, and from that moment on became Elizabeth's most devoted protector, bringing his favorite toys to show her and insisting on helping Tabitha whenever she cared for the baby. As the children grew, so did the ranch. By 1883, the Keller spread had become one of the most prosperous in the area, known for its well-bred horses and quality cattle. The original cabin where Tabitha had first stayed had been expanded into a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and a schoolroom had been added to the main house, where Tabitha now taught not only Samuel and Elizabeth, but also the children of the ranch hands and a few from neighboring properties. One crisp autumn day, as Tabitha was gathering apples from the small orchard they had planted in their second year of marriage, she spotted a wagon approaching along the main road. Shading her eyes against the sun, she recognized the town seal of Thornton Valley painted on the side. Straightening, she set down her basket and waited as the wagon drew closer. The driver was a man she recognized as the current mayor of Thornton Valley, accompanied by another man she didn't know, Mrs. Keller, the mayor called as he brought the wagon to a halt. "I hope we find you well." "Mayor Holloway," Tabitha acknowledged with a polite nod. "This is a surprise. What brings you to our ranch?" The mayor climbed down from the wagon, looking uncomfortable. "We've come with a proposition," he said, gesturing to his companion. "This is Mr. Davidson from the territorial governor's office. There's talk of establishing a proper school in these parts with state funding. Your name was put forward as a potential headmistress." Tabitha blinked in surprise. "My name?" "I'm flattered, but I'm quite content with my current arrangements." Mr. Davidson stepped forward. "We understand you're running something of an informal school here on your property, Mrs. Keller. What we're proposing would be an official position, with a salary and resources for a proper schoolhouse to serve all the children in the area." "I see," Tabitha said, considering the offer. "And Thornton Valley supports this proposal?" Mayor Holloway had the grace to look embarrassed. "The town council has unanimously endorsed your candidacy. We recognize that mistakes were made in the past, judgments that were, perhaps, hasty." Tabitha noted the carefully worded non-apology but chose not to press the point. "I appreciate the offer, gentlemen, but I would need to discuss it with my husband before giving you an answer." "Of course," Mr. Davidson said. "We'll be in Red Rock for the next 2 days. Perhaps you could send word once you've had a chance to consider." Tabitha nodded her agreement, and after a few more minutes of polite conversation, the men departed. She returned to her apple gathering, her mind turning over the unexpected proposition. That evening, after the children were in bed, she related the visit to Angus as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Nevada sky. "A headmistress," Angus said, considering the idea. "It would be a fine use of your talents, Tabitha. And I know you miss teaching a proper class sometimes." "I do," Tabitha admitted, "but the school would almost certainly be in or near Thornton Valley. I'm not sure I want to be associated with a place that once cast me out." Angus was quiet for a moment, his hand finding hers in the growing darkness. "You know what I think," he said finally. "I think it might be the finest kind of victory to return to Thornton Valley not as a disgraced woman, but as a respected teacher and the wife of a successful rancher. To show them not just that you survived without them, but that you thrived." Tabitha considered his words, finding wisdom in them. "You wouldn't mind if I accepted?" "Mind," Angus repeated. "Tabitha, I've never wanted anything but your happiness. If teaching a proper school again would make you happy, then I'm all for it. The children are old enough now that they could come with you during the day, and it's not so far that you couldn't be home each evening." Tabitha leaned her head against his shoulder, overwhelmed with gratitude for this man who continued to support her dreams even when they might inconvenience him. "I think I would like to accept," she said softly, "but only if the school is built on neutral ground, not within Thornton Valley itself. Somewhere accessible to all the children of the area, not just those from one town. The following spring, a new schoolhouse was erected on land donated by the Keller Ranch, situated midway between their property and Thornton Valley. Tabitha Keller was officially installed as its first headmistress, with a small but dedicated staff of teachers under her direction. On the day of the school's dedication, many of the same people who had once shunned Tabitha stood respectfully as she cut the ribbon across the schoolhouse door. Among them was Mrs. Holloway, the former mayor's wife, who approached Tabitha after the ceremony. "Mrs. Keller," she began stiffly, "I wanted to say, that is, I should have said long ago, I was wrong about you, about many things." Tabitha regarded the woman who had once led the charge to cast her out of town. Time had not been kind to Mrs. Holloway. Grief over the loss of her husband to influenza had etched deep lines in her once proud face. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway," Tabitha said simply. "Your apology is accepted." "And your son?" Mrs. Holloway asked hesitantly. "The boy, he is well. Samuel is thriving," Tabitha replied, a hint of pride creeping into her voice. "As is his sister, Elizabeth, and we're expecting our third child in the summer, Mrs." Holloway nodded, genuine happiness briefly illuminating her tired features. "I'm glad," she said. "Truly." As the woman walked away, Tabitha felt a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying lift from her shoulders, not forgetting but perhaps beginning to forgive. Angus appeared at her side, Samuel and Elizabeth dancing around him with the boundless energy of healthy, happy children. "Ready to head home?" he asked, his eyes searching her face with the same care and attention he had shown since the day they met. Tabitha looked at her family, the strong, good man who had built her a home beyond judgment, the son who had been the catalyst for their unlikely meeting, the daughter who carried their shared blood, and the new life growing within her that represented their continued hope for the future. "Yes," she said, taking his offered hand. "Let's go home." As they rode away from the new schoolhouse, Tabitha reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 7 years ago, she had stood alone at the edge of Thornton Valley, cast out and desperate, with nothing but uncertainty before her. Now she rode with her family toward a home built on love, respect, and second chances. The wilderness that had once seemed so barren and hostile had, in fact, offered her the freedom to create a life far richer than any she could have imagined for herself. And Angus Keller, the quiet cowboy who had stopped to help a stranger in need, had become the cornerstone of that life. "What are you thinking about?" Angus asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Tabitha smiled up at him, her heart full. "About how sometimes the end of one road is just the beginning of a better one." Angus nodded in understanding, his arm tightening around her waist as they rode together toward home, the home he had built for her beyond judgment, the home they had filled with love, and the home that would stand as a testament to the family they had created together against all odds. And as the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, painting the Nevada sky in hues of gold and crimson, Tabitha Keller knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just shelter, but true belonging in this land, in this life, and in the arms of the man who had seen value in her when others saw only shame. In the years that followed, the Keller family continued to thrive. Their third child, a son they named James, was born healthy and strong in the summer of 1884. The school Tabitha directed became known throughout the territory for its excellence, attracting families to settle in the area and helping to bridge the divide between the once judgmental town of Thornton Valley and the surrounding ranching community. Samuel, growing into a thoughtful young man with his mother's intelligence and his adoptive father's quiet strength, showed a natural aptitude for ranching and began to take on more responsibilities alongside Angus as he entered his teenage years. Elizabeth, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination, developed a passion for books and learning that suggested she might follow in Tabitha's footsteps one day. And young James, a perfect blend of both parents, exhibited a curiosity about the world and a kindness toward others that endeared him to everyone he met. Angus, whose initial act of compassion had set their shared journey in motion, never regretted for a moment the day he had stopped to help a pregnant woman in distress. What had begun as simple human decency had blossomed into the greatest blessing of his life: a family to love, a purpose to fulfill, and a partner who matched him in every way that mattered. And Tabitha, who had once faced the wilderness alone and afraid, found that the path she had been forced to walk had led her not to desolation, but to abundance, not to judgment, but to love that asked for nothing but offered everything. Together, they had built not just a home, but a legacy of kindness, resilience, and second chances, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone, in the lives of their children and in the community they had helped to create. The cabin where it all began still stood on the Keller property, preserved as a reminder of how the smallest act of compassion could change the course of lives. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were settled, Angus and Tabitha would sometimes sit on its porch, hand in hand, watching the sun set over the land they both loved, grateful for the journey that had brought them together and the love that had made them whole.